He lived alone for years until two stunning Apaches arrived asking for shelter. One stayed for love. The wind came first, not the gentle hush of passing seasons, but a howling, low-throated grief that shook the eaves of my cabin. It moaned through the chinks in the timber walls like an old man mourning his youth, and I listened to it from my place by the hearth. Out there, the world was dead. The snow had already buried my fields, broken the fence posts, and bowed the barn's roof under its weight. The cold had become an old friend, sinking deep into my bones, to the point where I had forgotten what warmth felt like. For 5 years, I had been living in a winter with no end, where the pain of losing my wife and child had become a perpetual storm in my soul. Once, I had loved storms, but now it was only a reminder that I was alone. And just past dusk, a sound broke that icy silence. The knock was soft, then louder, then rhythmic. 5 distinct raps, each more certain than the last. Not frantic, not pleading, not even cold, just deliberate, like a stranger demanding attention. I froze, fingers half buried in the flour sack, eyes darting toward the door, as if it might open itself. No one knocked here, not for years. Who could travel in this storm? Certainly not a friend. My heart twisted. The thought of a stranger invading this private space terrified me to my very core. That door was the last boundary between me and the world outside. Opening it was a reckless act, a decision I couldn't take back. But curiosity and a faint flicker of compassion, which I thought I had buried long ago, won. I stepped slowly toward the door, my hand trembling as it touched the iron latch. I took one breath, then another, and opened it. Standing before me, against the backdrop of white snow and the howling wind, were 5 women. They were not bandits, nor were they bounty hunters. They were Apache warriors. A young woman stepped forward. Her long black hair was tied back neatly, her cheekbones high, and her gaze was sharp. She wasn't afraid. "We seek shelter," she said. Her voice was deep, as if the storm itself had learned to speak, only for the night. Their presence immediately changed everything. The air in the cabin, which had been cold and still, was now filled with the warmth of 5 exhausted human beings. They were not visibly armed. There was no threat, only weariness. They took off their boots at the threshold, sat down by the hearth, and their silence was no longer that of loneliness, but of companionship. As I ladled stew into bowls, my hands no longer trembled. The warmth from the fire, combined with their living energy, began to melt the ice within me. Tala, the woman who had spoken to me, took a bowl of stew gently. When I gave her a blanket, her eyes were closed, but her hand reached out, gently closing over mine. It wasn't a grab. It was a promise that she was real, that she saw me. In that moment, I felt a strange connection. She didn't just see a lonely man, she saw a wounded soul, and she had reached out to touch it. My heart began to pound, as if it had just remembered how. I did not sleep that night. The wind howled louder, snow covered the windows entirely, but inside, the fire burned bright. 5 women and I kept it alive, not with words, but with presence. I no longer felt lonely. I no longer lived in an eternal winter. I had found a little warmth, a little light, and a little hope in the very storm of my life. When dawn broke, a pale gray light hovered beyond the frost-laced windows, and the stove crackled with the last breath of coals. My breath still plumed before me as I sat up in the rocking chair, still dressed from the night before. A quilt draped across my lap like a memory I hadn't meant to hold on to. For a moment, I wasn't sure if it had all happened. The knock, the women, the way the silence had turned warm instead of sharp. But then I heard it. The steady rhythm of someone splitting wood by the barn, not frenzied or careless, but measured, intentional, like a man who didn't want to owe anyone anything. I stood slowly, stiff from sleep, and pulled my shawl tight. The air bit my skin even inside. When I opened the door, the wind caught my breath. Snow stretched out in all directions, waist deep in some places, drifted high around the fence line. And there, half shadowed by the barn's lean-to, I stood. I didn't call out, just watched. Until, without turning, I said, mourning. My voice was lower now, quieter than last night. It vibrated in the air between us like the first deep note of a cello. I stepped forward a little, chin tucked against the cold. You'll freeze. No, I said, driving the axe down. Cold sharpens the edge. It keeps a man honest. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't try. Instead, I went back inside and warmed what little porridge remained, adding a pinch of dried apples I'd hidden from myself for weeks. When the women woke, they moved without chaos. They folded their furs, shook out their boots, and waited silently for bowls. Names still hadn't been shared. That silence didn't feel wrong. It felt respectful, like each word had weight and needed earning. Tala sat apart from the others, but near my kitchen counter. When I handed her my bowl, our fingers brushed again. This time, she didn't flinch, and neither did I. After breakfast, they went to work without being asked. 3 reinforced the barn wall where the storm had split a timber. 2 others shoveled a path from the house to the creek. 1 repaired the sagging chicken coop gate with a length of rawhide, while another returned to the axe. Always the axe. I didn't understand why women like them, Apache, feared by every settler within 100 miles, were here, treating my home like sacred ground, like something worth mending, and more than that, why I felt safer than I had in years. Tala had said to me that she wasn't afraid, but I was. I was afraid of change, afraid of loss again. But now, seeing them working together, I realized that their arrival wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity for me to find a part of myself that I thought I had lost forever. The wind shifted. It wasn't blowing away, but toward something, toward someone. Elias awoke before the sun. A pale gray light crept past the frost-laced windows, and the stove crackled with the last breath of coals. My breath plumed before my lips as I sat up in the rocker, still dressed from the night before. A quilt draped across my lap like a memory I hadn't meant to hold on to. For a moment, I wasn't sure if any of it was real. The knock, the women, the way the silence had turned warm instead of sharp. But then I heard it, the steady rhythm of my own axe splitting wood beside the barn. Not frenzied or careless, but intentional, like a man who didn't want to owe anyone anything. I stood slowly, stiff from sleep, and pulled my shawl tight. The air bit my skin even inside. When I opened the door, the wind took my breath away. Snow stretched out in all directions, waist deep in some places, drifted high around the fence line. And there, half shadowed by the barn, I stood. I didn't call out to them, just watched. Until, without turning, I said, mourning. My voice was lower now, quieter than last night. It vibrated in the air between us like the first deep note of a cello. I stepped forward a little, chin tucked against the cold. One of the women, Tala, approached the door. You'll freeze. No, I said, driving the axe down. Cold sharpens the edge. It keeps a man honest. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't try. Instead, I went back inside and warmed what little porridge remained, adding a pinch of dried apples I'd hidden from myself for weeks. When the women woke, they moved without chaos. They folded their furs, shook out their boots, and waited in silence for their bowls. Names still hadn't been shared. That silence didn't feel wrong. It felt respectful, like each word had weight and needed to be earned. Tala sat apart from the others, but near my kitchen counter. When I handed her bowl to her, our fingers brushed again. This time, she didn't flinch, and neither did I. After breakfast, they went to work without me asking. 3 reinforced the barn wall where the storm had split a timber. 2 others shoveled a path from the house to the creek. 1 repaired the sagging chicken coop gate with a length of rawhide. I returned to the axe. Always the axe. I didn't understand it. Why women like them, Apache, feared by everyone, were here, treating my home like sacred ground, like something worth mending. And more than that, why I felt safer than I had in years. By noon, the wind had slowed, the sky breaking into patches of dull silver. One of the women, older, with gray-streaked hair, sat beside my porch, carving a length of bone with a slow, rhythmic motion. She didn't speak English, Or perhaps she just chose not to. But when our eyes met, she nodded as if saying, "We see you and we mean no harm." I tried to imagine what my neighbors would say. A man like me, alone, housing warriors in my kitchen, warming their bodies with my stove. I could already hear the whispers. "He's lost his mind." Or worse, that sharp echo of judgment pressed against the glass of my memory like a handprint. They judged me after my wife died. They said I didn't cry right, I was weak, not a man, didn't bury her fast enough, that maybe God had turned his back. But none of those people had lifted a finger when my roof sagged or when my baby burned with fever. They only offered prayers when what I needed was presence. That evening, one of the younger women, no older than 25, laid down a carved piece of driftwood by my fire. It was shaped like a buffalo's head, rough but strong, a gift. She nodded once, solemn, and returned to her place on the floor. My throat tightened. Later, as the fire danced and the shadows grew longer, Tala approached my table. In the lamplight, I saw her eyes clearly for the first time, gray, not cold, but worn, like stones smoothed by years of rivers. Her face bore the weight of stories she hadn't told. "You're not afraid," she said. "I was," I answered honestly. "But not now." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because none of you have taken anything you didn't ask for." A pause. "Then we're not what they say." I met her gaze. "Neither am I." Silence swelled again, but it was soft now. Comfortable, like two souls listening for the same distant sound. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias." She repeated it once, quietly, as if tasting it. "Elias." There was something reverent in the way she said it, almost like a prayer left unsaid for too long. That night, as the wind picked up again and the sky threatened another round of snow, the women laid out their furs in the same quiet order. But Tala stayed near the door, her back to it, as if keeping watch, not for danger, but for me. I watched from the stairs. For the first time in years, I didn't dread the darkness. It felt like a blanket now, not a trap. I went to my room, closing the door gently behind me, and sat at the edge of the bed, hands in my lap. I could feel the carved hawk stone in my pocket, warmed by my body. I had always thought that loneliness was a kind of death you lived through. But maybe it was something else, a waiting, a hollow waiting for someone who wouldn't ask me to fill the silence, only to share it. I turned down my lamp and stared at the ceiling, my breath steady. Tomorrow the snow might melt, or it might rise again. The women might leave or stay longer, but something had already shifted inside me, something too quiet to name, too sacred to rush. And then, just as sleep was pulling me under, there came another knock. Not at the main door this time, but at my window. A single knock. Then silence. I rose slowly, my heart rising with me. I pulled back the curtain, and there she stood. Tala, not with urgency, not with hunger, but with a calm, wordless question in her eyes. And I didn't say a word. I simply opened the window. The first thaw came quietly. A single drip from the eave, then another. The snow began to slump along the roof's edge, like shoulders loosening after a long grief. Days had passed since the women arrived. Now only one remained. Tala had not explained why she stayed. She simply hadn't left. I didn't ask. Each morning I found something mended. Hinges repaired with leather, logs stacked precisely by size, the fence line reset where the storm had bent it. She worked without instruction. She slept near the hearth, always rising before me. Sometimes I wondered if she slept at all. The first thaw came heavy, a single drip from the eaves, then another, but they carried no gentleness. The snow began to slump along the roof's edge, large chunks of it crashing to the ground with a rough thud. 3 days had passed since the 5 Apache women arrived. Now only one remained. Tala had not explained why she stayed. She simply hadn't left. And I didn't ask. Each morning, I found something mended. Hinges repaired with leather. Logs stacked precisely by size. The fence line reset where the storm had bent it. She worked without instruction. She slept near the hearth, always rising before me. Sometimes I wondered if she slept at all. Our words were few, but the silence between us softened. We moved like two people who'd once been strangers, but now shared something raw. Not romance, not yet. Something older, like recognition. One afternoon, Tala was stirring the stew when I came in from the cold, tracking snow in without apology. She wore a piece of hide tied in front like an apron, and the warmth from the fire filled the room. She held a rabbit in one hand, already skinned, laid it on the table without a word. I turned, wiped my hands on my apron, and met her eyes. "Thank you," I said. She nodded, then added, "You were running low." She hadn't needed me to tell her that. She'd noticed. Later, as the rabbit simmered and the room filled with a faint smell of sage and meat, I set 2 bowls on the table, one at my place and one across. It was a simple act, but it felt like lighting a lantern in a long, dark room. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she walked to the shelf above the hearth, where a line of yellowed books gathered dust. She picked one up, Walden, worn at the spine, and turned it in her hands. "You read?" she asked. "Used to," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I meant. "Still do," she said. "You just forgot." I didn't argue. That night, we ate in near silence. But when I set my spoon down, she spoke again. "You shaved." I blinked. After all these years, I had decided to pick up the razor. The blade was dull, and I'd nicked myself in a few places, but the thick, tangled beard was gone. My face was bare. "I haven't had a reason to care about that," I said, trying to laugh. "You have a reason now." Her words dropped gently, like snow against glass. I looked at her and for once didn't look away, but something inside me pulled back, not out of fear, but out of shame. I wasn't ready for what she might mean, or what I might want. The next morning, I avoided her. I sharpened my hunting knife harder than it needed, gathered kindling with stiff arms, busying myself with anything that kept my eyes down. I caught glimpses of her outside, repairing the chicken coop, wiping frost from the window panes, tying a rope between the barn and the porch to guide us during storms. She didn't ask why I kept my distance. That night, I found a bundle of cured jerky left on the table. No note, just her care, laid down quietly like a bridge I hadn't dared to cross. Still, I didn't cross it. 3 more days passed. On the 4th, while dragging a heavy log from the forest, I slipped. The log rolled, pinning my leg hard. My breath vanished. I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. The sky above me was pale and distant. The snow beside me smelled of bark, earth, and something older, like time folding in on itself. And then she was there. Tala appeared in silence, kneeling beside me as if the wind itself had guided her. Her hands, warm and steady, slipped beneath my shoulders. "You're hurt," she said softly. I tried to stand. I couldn't. She didn't carry me, but she helped me up, letting me lean on her shoulder as we walked back to the cabin. Her arms held me gently, but with immense strength. It was that very gentleness that undid me. The way her soft hands touched me, a feeling I had forgotten long ago. Inside, she laid me down by the fire, removed my boots, and pulled a quilt over my legs. Then she disappeared. I closed my eyes. The pain throbbed dull and pulsing, not just in my ankle, but in places much older. When she returned, she brought warm water and willow bark. She touched me only where necessary. Brief, careful, never lingering. Her fingers were calloused, but reverent. "You need to rest," she murmured. "I'll take care of the rest." And she did. I watched, half drowsy, as she moved through my home like she belonged, tending to the stove, feeding the chickens, even rinsing the spilled laundry I'd left in the basin. No ceremony, no pride, just presence. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought of her hands. Not the strength in them, but the restraint. When dawn broke, I rose slowly and walked into the kitchen. My ankle still ached, but I moved. I chose to move. I found her near the barn feeding the horses. She turned at my approach. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." She studied me a moment, then nodded. "You should be careful," she said gently. "The snow still hides teeth." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. She stepped closer, hesitated, then reached up so slowly and touched the long scar on my forehead. "You're strong," she said. "No," I whispered. She tilted her head. "You think strong means loud." I didn't know how to answer that. That evening, I wore a new shirt. A shirt I had washed and pressed. It was still a bit stiff, but it no longer carried the smell of loneliness. Tala said nothing when she saw it, but her gaze softened, and something unspoken passed between us. We ate together again, our fingers brushing. This time, neither pulled away. When she stood to stoke the fire, I found myself watching the way she moved, how careful she was with my thing, how nothing about her demanded space, but everything about her earned it. "Why did you stay?" I asked suddenly. She paused. The fire popped behind her. "You didn't ask me to leave," she said. It was a simple answer, but it filled the room like a hymn. That night, as I climbed the ladder to the loft, I stopped halfway and looked down. Tala looked up from her blanket. "Will you keep the fire going tonight?" She nodded, and I slept soundly for the first time in years. But in the morning, there were fresh boot prints in the snow. Not mine. They led to the barn, and then back into the woods, 3 sets. The morning air was sharp, slicing through the gaps in my coat as I stood on the porch, staring at the tracks. 3 sets, deliberate and uneven, carved through the snow like a warning written in a language I couldn't fully read. They circled the barn, lingered near the chicken coop, then vanished into the tree line. My breath hung in clouds, and my ankle throbbed under the weight of standing, but I didn't move. The tracks weren't Tala's. Her steps were lighter, more purposeful, leaving prints as clean as her axe swings. These were heavier, careless, the kind made by men who thought the world owed them something. Tala emerged from the barn, her hands dusted with frost, a bundle of kindling tucked under one arm. She stopped when she saw me staring at the snow. Her eyes followed mine to the tracks, and her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The air between us had shifted, grown taut, like a bowstring waiting for release. "They came close," she said finally, her voice low, steady like the creek under ice. "Not close enough to touch, but close enough to look." I nodded, my throat tight. "Locals?" The word felt heavy, like a stone I'd been carrying since the whispers started after my wife and child were gone. Locals meant judgment, meant men like Amos Reed or Cal Dorsey, who'd ride out to check on me but leave with nothing but gossip and scorn. Tala's gaze flicked to the woods, then back to me. "Not lost," she said. "They knew where they were going." The weight of that settled in my chest. I'd lived 5 years in this cabin, letting the world forget me, thinking I'd buried myself deep enough to avoid trouble. But trouble, like snow, always finds a way to creep in. I limped back inside, Tala following, without a word. The fire was low, but she knelt and fed it with the kindling she'd brought, coaxing it back to life with a patience that made my own restlessness feel childish. I sat at the table, my hands idle, the carved hawkstone still in my pocket, warm against my thigh. I wanted to ask her what she thought the tracks meant, what she feared, but the question felt like an admission of weakness. Instead, I said, "You don't have to stay." She didn't look up from the fire. "You keep saying that." Her voice wasn't sharp, but it cut through the silence all the same. "And you keep staying," I said, softer now, almost afraid of my own words. She turned then, her gray eyes catching the firelight, steady and unyielding. "This place is yours, Elias. It's worth staying for." She paused, then added, "So are you." My breath caught, not because of the words, but the way she said them like they were a truth she'd known longer than I had. I looked away, my fingers tracing the grain of the table. "I'm not what you think I am," I muttered. "I'm not strong, I'm just here." Tala stood, brushing her hands on her hide apron. "You think surviving is nothing. You think waking up every day alone with that weight in your chest is nothing." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the sage and smoke on her. "That's not nothing. That's everything." I didn't know how to answer that. The fire cracked, and outside, the wind picked up again, a low moan that sounded less like grief now and more like a question. Tala didn't wait for me to respond. She moved to the door, checked the latch, then glanced at the rifle leaning against the wall. You know how to use that, she asked. I nodded, though the truth was murkier. I'd fired it once, years ago, at a coyote that got too bold. The shot had been wild, and the coyote had run off laughing. Good, she said. Keep it close. The day passed in a quiet rhythm, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was watchful, like the moment before a storm breaks. Tala went about her tasks, checking the horses, reinforcing the barn door, sharpening her knife with slow, deliberate strokes. I tried to help, hauling water from the creek despite the ache in my ankle. But every step felt like I was waiting for something to shatter. By dusk, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the tracks in the snow were half buried by fresh flurries. But they were still there, like ghosts refusing to be forgotten. That evening we ate in silence, the stew thinner now, stretched with the last of the root cellar's offerings. Tala didn't sit across from me this time. She took her bowl to the window, standing with her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the frost-laced glass. They'll come tonight, she said. Not a question, just a fact. My spoon paused halfway to my mouth. How do you know? She didn't turn, because they're not patient men. They're hungry, not for food, for something else. I set my spoon down, the weight of her words sinking in. What do they want? She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. They want what men like that always want. To take what isn't theirs, to break what doesn't bend. My hands clenched into fists under the table. I thought of my wife, her laughter, the way she'd hum while mending my shirts. I thought of my daughter, her tiny fingers curled around mine. And I thought of this cabin, the only thing I had left, now holding a woman who saw me when I'd forgotten how to see myself. They won't take this, I said, my voice rougher than I meant. Tala's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Number they won't. She set her bowl down and moved to the hearth, pulling a small leather pouch from her belt. She sprinkled something into the fire, dried herbs, maybe sage or cedar, and the air filled with a sharp, clean scent. For protection, she said, catching my look. Not magic, just a reminder. The spirits listen when you ask them to. I didn't know what to make of that, but I nodded anyway. The fire seemed to burn brighter, the shadows softer. Later, as the wind grew sharper, Tala took her place by the door again, her knife now tucked into her belt, visible but not drawn. I sat in the rocker, the rifle across my lap, its weight both foreign and familiar. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared, like a vow we hadn't spoken aloud. I wanted to tell her I was afraid, not of the men who might come, but of what I might lose if they did. I wanted to tell her that her presence had cracked something open in me, something I thought had frozen solid years ago. But the words stayed locked in my throat, and she didn't ask for them. Just past midnight, the knock came again. Not soft this time, not rhythmic. It was a single, heavy thud, like a fist demanding entry. Tala was on her feet before I could move, her hand on the knife, her body angled between me and the door. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice calm but unyielding. I gripped the rifle, my palms slick, and stood slowly, my ankle protesting. The knock came again, harder, followed by a voice, rough and slurred with whiskey. "Open up, Elias. We know you're in there. Got company, don't ya?" Tala's eyes met mine, and in them I saw not fear, but resolve. She nodded once, sharp, and I moved to the door, the rifle heavy in my hands. I didn't open it yet. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. A laugh, low and mean, answered. "Just neighbors. Come to check on ya. Heard you're keeping strange folk. Thought we'd see for ourselves." I recognized the voice Amos Reed, a man who'd once offered me a Bible verse while my daughter burned with fever, then sold my neighbor's land out from under him when he couldn't pay his debts. "They're not welcome here," I said, my grip tightening on the rifle. Tala stepped closer, her shoulder brushing mine, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. Another voice, younger, sharper, cut through the night. "Open the damn door, Elias, or we'll open it for you." The threat hung in the air, heavy as the snow outside. Tala's hand moved to the latch, but she didn't open it. Instead, she leaned close, her breath warm against my ear. "Let them talk," she murmured. Men like that love their own voices. It gives us time. Time for what? I didn't ask. But I trusted her, more than I'd trusted anyone in years. The fire crackled behind us, the herb-scented smoke curling upward, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace, not yet, but something close, a certainty that whatever came next, we'd face it together. The third knock came, louder, more impatient, and then the sound of boots crunching snow, circling the cabin. They weren't just here to talk, they were here to take. Tala moved first, silent as a shadow, slipping to the window to peer through a gap in the frost. "3 of them," she whispered. "One's got a shotgun, the others have knives, maybe pistols." My heart pounded, but her calm steadied me. "What do we do?" I asked. She turned, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "We don't let them in, and if they try, we make them regret it." She motioned for me to stay by the door, then moved to the back of the cabin, checking the windows, securing the shutters with quick, practiced hands. I stood my ground, the rifle raised now, its barrel pointed at the door. The cold metal felt alive in my hands, like it was waking up after years of sleep. Outside, the voices grew louder, taunting now. "Come on, Elias. Don't make this hard. We just want to talk to your guest. Share the warmth, you know." Tala returned, her knife drawn now, its blade catching the firelight. She stood beside me, her shoulder against mine, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing alone. "When they come," she said softly, "aim high. Scare them first. If that doesn't work, don't hesitate." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The fire popped again, and the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Then the door rattled, not a knock this time, but a shove, testing the latch. Tala's hand tightened on her knife, and I raised the rifle, my finger brushing the trigger. "Last chance," I called, my voice hard now, fueled by something I hadn't felt in years' defiance. "Walk away." The answer was a laugh, cruel and confident, followed by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. The door burst open, and the storm came inside. The wind roared through the open door, carrying snow and the sharp scent of pine. The fire flickered, casting jagged shadows as 3 men loomed in the threshold. The leader, broad and bearded, held a shotgun leveled at my chest. His grin was all teeth, like a wolf that had already tasted blood. Behind him, 2 others flanked, one wiry with a knife glinting in his hand, the other younger, twitchy, a pistol half drawn. Tala didn't flinch. Her knife was steady, her stance low, like a panther coiled for the leap. "Elias," the bearded one drawled, stepping forward, his boots tracking slush onto the floorboards. "You've been hiding a treasure, ain't you?" His eyes slid to Tala, lingering too long, and I felt my grip on the rifle tighten until my knuckles ached. "Drop the gun, old man. Let's keep this friendly." Tala's voice cut through, sharp as her blade. "He's not your friend, neither am I." She stepped forward, placing herself between me and the shotgun. Her braid swung slightly, the beads in it catching the firelight like stars. The bearded man's grin faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. I saw it, doubt, flickering in his eyes. "Move," I said, my voice low. "Steady now, or I shoot." I raised the rifle higher, aiming at his shoulder. Tala was right, scare them first. The air grew thick, the kind of quiet that hums before lightning strikes. The wiry one shifted, his knife hand twitching, but the younger one, the twitchy one, was the problem. His pistol was out now, shaking in his grip, his eyes darting between us. "Don't be stupid," Tala said, her tone calm but laced with steel. "You're not fast enough." She was talking to the young one, her eyes locked on his, reading him like a book she'd already finished. He swallowed hard, his pistol dipping slightly. The bearded man barked a laugh, trying to reclaim control. "You think you scare us, woman? You're 1 against 3. 2, I corrected, stepping beside Tala. Our shoulders touched, and I felt her strength, her certainty grounding me. The fire snapped behind us, the only sound for a heartbeat. Then the wiry one lunged, his knife arcing toward Tala. She moved faster than thought, sidestepping, her own blade flashing up to meet his. Metal clanged, sharp and bright, and the wiry man stumbled back, clutching his forearm, blood seeping through his fingers. The young one panicked, his pistol jerking up. I fired. The rifle's roar filled the cabin, and the bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him into the doorframe. He screamed, dropping the gun, and scrambled backward, half falling into the snow. The bearded man swung his shotgun toward me, but Tala was already there, her knife at his throat, pressing just enough to draw a thin line of red. "Don't," she whispered, and he froze. "Get out," I said, reloading the rifle with hands that didn't shake anymore. The bearded man's eyes burned with rage, but he saw the truth in Tala's blade, in my steady aim. He backed away, hands raised, stepping over the young one still whimpering in the snow. The wiry man followed, clutching his bleeding arm, cursing under his breath. They retreated into the storm, their shapes swallowed by the white. Tala closed the door, latching it firmly, and the cabin fell silent again, save for the fire's soft crackle. She sheathed her knife, her hands steady, but her eyes met mine, searching. "You're not hurt," she said, more statement than question. I shook my head, setting the rifle down. My heart was still pounding, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something alive, something I hadn't felt since the world turned cold. "You didn't hesitate," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Neither did you," I replied. She nodded, and for a moment, we just stood there, the space between us warm with unspoken trust. The storm outside howled on, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else's story. We cleaned the cabin in silence, mopping the slush, checking the shutters. Tala boiled water, steeping the last of the herbs, and we sat by the fire, sipping from chipped mugs. The hawk carving she'd given me days ago sat on the table, its smooth lines catching the light. I traced it with my thumb, feeling the weight of her presence beside me. "They'll come back," I said, not because I doubted her, but because the world had taught me to expect the worst. She leaned back, her braid brushing the chair. "Let them. We'll be ready." Her voice was steady, certain, and I believed her. Not just because of her strength, but because of us together. We were more than the sum of our scars. The next morning, the snow had slowed, the sky breaking into patches of pale blue. Tala stood by the window, watching the horizon. I joined her, our breaths fogging the glass. "What now?" I asked. She turned, her eyes soft but fierce. "We live, Elias. Not just survive. Live." And so we did. We rebuilt the fence, stronger this time. We chopped wood, shared meals, and let the silence between us grow into something warm, something ours. The storm had brought her to me, and though the world outside remained cold, inside, we'd found fire enough to keep it at bay.